On a summer afternoon in 1934, a man with at least half a dozen different names walked onto a train platform in the American Midwest and effectively erased himself from history. He'd told some followers he came from Mecca, and he'd told others he came from royalty. His fingerprints sat in a California prison file under a name nobody in his movement had ever heard. In just 4 years, he'd built a religion that would shape American life for the rest of the century. And not one investigator, follower, or journalist would ever say for sure who he was or where the train went. The story starts in 1930 on the streets of Detroit's Black Bottom neighborhood. A light-skinned man in a tailored suit walked door to door selling silks, raincoats, and small religious tracts. He spoke softly and eloquently, with an accent his customers couldn't quite place. He told the black families he met that the cloth came from Mecca, and that he'd traveled a long way to find them because they were his people, descendants of a noble lost tribe. Black Bottom in 1930 was a neighborhood of recent migrants from the South. Tens of thousands of African Americans had moved north during the Great Migration, fleeing the Jim Crow South for the auto factories of Detroit. The Depression had landed on black workers quite hard, and unemployment in the neighborhood ran well above 50%. Storefront churches, unlicensed doctors, fortune tellers, and street preachers were a regular part of life. So when a foreign-looking stranger began telling people they were a noble people robbed of their original identity, plenty of folks listened. He went by W.D. Fard. He also went by Wallace Fard, Wally Farad, Professor Ford, and a handful of other names that shifted depending on who was asking. The pamphlets he handed out with the cloth turned out to be religious tracts. Within months he was holding meetings in apartments, then in rented halls, and within a year he had a congregation. He called it the Allah Temple of Islam, and within 4 years he'd built a new religion. The faith Fard preached was unlike anything else in American Islam, partly because almost none of his early followers had ever met an actual Muslim. He taught that black Americans were the original human beings, descendants of an ancient Asiatic tribe called Shabazz. He taught that white people had been bred into existence thousands of years earlier by a renegade scientist named Yaqub, who is now more famous as a meme than anything else. He laid down dietary rules, codes of dress and conduct, and a clear separation from what he called the slave master's religion. He gave members new Islamic-themed surnames, emphasizing a belief that these were the true ancestral surnames of most or all black Americans. In August of 1931, a former Georgia factory worker named Elijah Poole attended one of Fard's meetings at his wife's urging. Poole was small, intense, and looking for something, and by his own later account, he walked up to Fard afterward and asked if he was the Mahdi, the long-promised redeemer in Islam. Fard reportedly said that he was, but his time hadn't yet come, and from that moment until Fard's vanishing 3 years later, the two men were rarely apart. Fard taught him constantly, gave him the surname Kareem and then Muhammad, and elevated him to supreme minister of the movement. Elijah Muhammad would go on to lead the Nation of Islam for over 4 decades and mentor a young Malcolm X, but it was Fard who built the engine. The Allah Temple's rapid growth attracted the wrong kind of attention. In November of 1932, a member named Robert Harris, known in the movement as Robert Carriam, stabbed and bludgeoned a man on a homemade altar in a Detroit apartment. The newspapers ran with the story for weeks, calling Fard's movement a dangerous cult that promoted such practices. The slaying led to the technical dissolution of the Allah Temple of Islam, which Elijah Muhammad would soon reconstitute under the name we still know today, the Nation of Islam. Detroit police questioned Fard repeatedly in the aftermath, and he gave them a different birthplace nearly every time he was asked. In one interview, he said New Zealand, and he told another investigator Portland, Oregon, and a third Polynesia. Detectives at the time had no idea which story was true, if any of them, and they decided that they really didn't care to deal with him anymore. He was charged with disorderly conduct and ordered to leave the city, but he came back. This was, in essence, a trumped-up charge. And the fact that the authorities treated him as a major threat paradoxically caused him to gain more followers. Or perhaps it wasn't paradoxical after all. If he wasn't building a movement, the authorities wouldn't have targeted him. Despite being kicked out of Detroit, that's where his growing power base was, and naturally he returned. But the results were largely the same. They expelled him again, and by late 1933, his presence in Detroit had become legally untenable, and he relocated to a temple Elijah Muhammad had set up in Chicago. Through all of this, the movement kept growing, and new temples opened in other cities. The man who'd shown up on a Detroit doorstep 3 years earlier as a salesman now ran a religious organization that was sweeping certain parts of the nation. He still hadn't told anyone where he was actually from, and almost no one had thought to push him hard on it. Here's where things really start to come apart. Almost nothing about Fard's biography is internally consistent. He told different students different stories, sometimes within the same week. To some, he claimed to be an Arab from Mecca, the son of a wealthy Muslim father and a white mother, sent across the world to find the lost tribe of his own people. To others, he said he was descended from the Quraysh, the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad himself, and that he was a direct lineal descendant of the Prophet. Now, that claim isn't actually that unusual, since there are tens of millions of people around the world who count themselves amongst his descendants. Some accounts have him claiming descent from the Egyptian royal family, which, if true, would have made him at least partly Albanian by ancestry. After his disappearance, Elijah Muhammad would teach that Fard had been something more than human. The people who actually met him couldn't agree on what he looked like either. Witnesses described him variously as Arab, Turkish, Polynesian, Indian, mixed race, Jamaican, or even as white. He also spoke English with an accent nobody could really place, though all sources agree that his English was fluent and eloquent. His selective service card from the 1910s reportedly listed his birthplace as Shinkai, in what's now Afghanistan. The translations of the Quran he used in his sermons came from South Asian Muslim publishers. The surnames he assigned to members tracked more closely with the Indo-Pakistani Muslim world than with Arab Mecca. For instance, his focus on the name Shabazz tracks strongly with a Sufi saint who is extremely popular in that part of the world. Further, some religious scholars believe that the version of Islam he preached was strongly influenced by the Ahmadi branch of Islam. This is a branch of Islam that developed in what is now Pakistan and has adherents mostly from that region. Then there's the government's version, which is by far the most documented and also the most controversial. Before I get into this version, it's necessary to remember this version was developed in the decades after Fard had already disappeared. The Federal Bureau of Investigation began building a file on Fard during the 1940s, after the nation's anti-government rhetoric drew federal scrutiny. They returned to the case heavily in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when J. Edgar Hoover had become preoccupied with Elijah Muhammad. The Bureau's conclusion, drawn from fingerprint matches, prison records, and census documents, was that W.D. Fard was a man named Wallace Dodd Ford. According to those records, Ford was born around February 25th, 1891, in New Zealand, to a white British father and a Polynesian mother. While this was often repeated as fact, the FBI would later admit it couldn't fully verify this account either. They believed he immigrated to the United States in 1913 and drifted through a string of low-wage jobs in the Pacific Northwest and California before settling in Los Angeles around 1920. By the mid-1920s, he was running a small cafe and on the side dealing narcotics with a business partner. On January 20th, 1926, the Los Angeles police arrested him on charges related to those operations, and a few weeks later they arrested him again for the same offense. He pleaded guilty, and on June 12th, 1926, he was sentenced to between 6 months and 6 years at San Quentin. His intake records list him as inmate number 42314, and mugshots from that month would later end up quietly in the FBI's file. He was paroled on May 27th, 1929, and within a year, by the Bureau's reconstruction, he'd turned up in Detroit selling silks. The Nation of Islam has rejected this entire account from the beginning, and many researchers have raised significant questions about the chain of evidence. By the spring of 1934, Fard's situation had become precarious. He was wanted in Detroit, watched closely in Chicago. He had allegedly been threatened by the cops in Chicago, trying to get him to leave town, with the implication that something might happen to him if he decided to stick around. According to followers, sometime that spring or early summer, he told Elijah Muhammad the movement was ready to operate without him for a time. He then arranged what he described to his followers as a temporary departure. By some accounts, he boarded a flight to Chicago, by others a train, and in one telling, Elijah Muhammad himself saw him off at the station. The last verified contact anyone in the movement ever had with him was a letter, postmarked from Mexico, that arrived in March of 1934. But there was more. After that, he traveled west. He briefly visited Hazel Barton, the mother of his child, in Los Angeles. She later told FBI investigators that he was driving a new car with California plates and white sheets draped over the seats. He told her he was going back to New Zealand, and he left the sheets behind and drove away. That's the last reasonably solid trace of him. There were reported sightings later in Mexico City, Turkey, and Los Angeles in the late 1930s, but none was ever confirmed. He missed every major event of the movement he'd founded. He was simply gone. What's almost as strange as his disappearance is how cleanly he managed it. By 1942, the FBI had a fingerprint file, a list of aliases, and the address of a woman who'd had his child. They couldn't find him, and they'd keep looking for the next 20 years and come up with nothing. His son was later questioned by the FBI, but he as well had no idea who his father really was, having also been told conflicting accounts. The most prosaic scholarly reconstruction has Fard simply going home, never to return to the United States. Other theories run darker, and some have suggested Fard was eliminated, possibly by the government or possibly by someone in a rival organization. And then there are the believers, who have never accepted that he passed at all. To the Nation of Islam, Fard didn't disappear. He returned back to Mecca to oversee his work from a distance. It's a freezing Friday afternoon in March of 1621, on the edge of a half-built English settlement in what would one day be called Massachusetts. Almost half the people who stepped off the Mayflower 4 months earlier are already in the ground. They're buried in unmarked graves the survivors have been smoothing over, so no one watching from the woods can count the bodies and see just how badly things are going. The men patrolling the outskirts of the settlement are sick, underfed, and braced for an attack any day. Just then, a man walks out of the trees, and he moves with the calm of someone who's done this before. He's a tall, barefoot Native American man, and wearing very little except a leather belt around his waist. His hair is long behind and cropped close across the front. His face is bare, and he's carrying a bow with 2 arrows, one of them tipped and one of them not. He passes the startled militia, walks into the heart of the village, looks the survivors in the eye, and welcomes them to the country. But here's the really weird thing, at least at first glance. He greeted them in perfect English. The truly bizarre thing, though, would be the series of events this chance encounter set off, and these would change American and world history forever. The Plymouth settlers had drifted into the tip of Cape Cod the previous November after a brutal Atlantic crossing. Then they spent weeks searching the coastline for somewhere they could survive a New England winter. They'd finally settled on a half-cleared patch of ground that had once been a Native American village called Patuxet. Between roughly 1616 and 1619, a wave of disease, probably carried along the coast by European fishermen and traders, had ravaged the region. The disease moved through the region and wiped out somewhere between a half and 9/10 of the local population. The settlement had been hollowed out, and the newcomers were building on top of a graveyard, which was quickly becoming their own cemetery as well. That first winter had finished what the voyage started. Out of about 100 passengers, only around 53 were still alive by spring, and most of the crew had died as well. The survivors had no real grasp of who their neighbors were, what language they spoke, or whether the people watching them from the trees considered them guests, trespassers, or worse. They'd already had a few tools, including a couple of muskets, quietly disappear from the edges of the camp. They were running low on food themselves, and then, on the 16th of March by their calendar, the man with the leather belt strolled in. His name was Samoset, and the first thing to understand about him is that he wasn't local. He didn't live anywhere near Plymouth, and he wasn't a member of the Wampanoag Confederacy, whose territory the colonists had stumbled into. He was an Eastern Abenaki Sagamore, a kind of regional leader, from the rocky coast of present-day Maine, hundreds of miles to the northeast. His home base was around Monhegan and Pemaquid, an island and a point that English fishing crews had used for years. And that's the second thing. The Maine coast in the early 1600s was already a busy workplace for English fleets. Captains would sail across each spring, haul cod through the summer, dry it on the rocky beaches, trade with the locals for furs, and head home with their holds full. Samoset had spent enough time around these men to pick up their language. He knew specific captains by name, could rattle off the names of ports back in England, and had opinions about which Englishmen were decent and which weren't. When he turned up at Plymouth, he'd been traveling in the South for around 8 months, visiting as a guest among the Wampanoag. So while the encounter blindsided the colonists, it didn't blindside him. Samoset had been walking up to Englishmen and speaking their language for years. William Bradford, who would later serve decades as governor, recorded his own quiet astonishment. The colonists could follow the man's broken English well enough, he noted. They just couldn't believe they were hearing it. The colonists' record of that Friday is one of the stranger documents in early American history, largely because they were shocked at how fluent in English he was. They were also quite surprised at how comfortable he was with English customs, and how he seemed to implicitly understand the culture. Of course, in actuality, this wasn't implicit at all, but rather something that had been cultivated by Samoset over the course of years, but the colonists didn't realize this. According to the diary-style account kept by the settlers themselves and later published in London, Samoset didn't sneak in. He walked. He moved with the easy confidence of a man on familiar ground. His first question, reportedly, was a quick question about where he could get some beer and some food, which I have to say, is incredibly relatable even 400 years later. The settlers were almost out of beer themselves and they didn't want to part with it, so they handed him something a bit stronger instead. They also brought him bread, butter, cheese, a kind of pudding, and a piece of roasted mallard duck. He accepted everything cheerfully and ate it while the colonists tried to process what was happening. He kept talking the whole time. In a single afternoon, he gave them more useful information about the country than they'd gathered on their own in 4 months. He told them whose land they were on, and he named the most powerful local leader, a man named Massasoit. He laid out the rough political situation between the neighboring peoples, and he explained that the village they'd settled on had been emptied by the recent epidemic. They asked about the missing tools and the figures in the trees, and he answered without hesitation. Those were probably the Nauset, he told them, a people from further down Cape Cod with good reason to dislike Englishmen. A few years earlier, an English captain had landed among them, seized 7 of their men, and sailed off, and the Nauset hadn't forgotten. He also mentioned that there was another man nearby who spoke English far better than he did, a man who had actually crossed the Atlantic and lived in London. That man was Tisquantum, the figure history would come to remember as Squanto. When evening came, the colonists tried politely to send Samoset on his way. The weather was against him, and he eventually spent the night in the house of one of their members, where they reportedly kept a careful eye on him until morning. The colonists still weren't entirely sure that the man could be trusted, suspecting that his friendly demeanor could actually be a ruse. Samoset came back the next morning, ate breakfast with the settlers, accepted a knife, a ring, and a bracelet as parting gifts, and walked off promising to return with men ready to trade fur. Within 2 days, he was back at the gate with 5 other men. A few days later he came back again, this time with Squanto in tow. Squanto had a story all his own. He'd been seized from this very coast in 1614 by an English captain named Thomas Hunt. He'd grabbed roughly 20 other Patuxet men in the same raid and sold them in Spain. Squanto was one of the very few to find his way home, and he'd somehow worked his way out of captivity, reached England, learned the language, and lived for a stretch in London. He was shipped back across the ocean, only to walk into his home village and find everyone he'd grown up with already deceased or simply gone. Anyway, the story of Squanto is something for another video, because there's a lot of fascinating elements there, and more than a few historical mysteries. Through Samoset and Squanto, the colonists could now do something they had no way of doing on their own. They could speak directly with Massasoit. On the 22nd of March, Massasoit himself came down to the settlement, attended by around 60 of his men. The colonists cleared a room, laid down a green rug and a few cushions, and hosted him under arms on both sides. That last part probably gives you an idea of the level of tension, but Samoset and Squanto, being familiar with both languages and cultures, helped immensely. The talks, brokered through the 2 translators, produced a mutual defense agreement, now usually called the Pilgrim Wampanoag Treaty. Each side promised not to attack the other, and both committed to coming to each other's aid if attacked by a third party. That agreement would hold, in one form or another, for more than half a century, finally collapsing in 1675, with the conflict led by Massasoit's own son. You can argue, and many historians have, that the treaty was driven less by goodwill than by leverage. The Wampanoag had been gutted by the same epidemic that emptied the village where the Pilgrims settled, and they had powerful and unfriendly neighbors not far to the west. An alliance with newcomers who had firearms made a hard kind of sense. But none of that diplomacy would have been possible if a man hadn't walked out of the woods first and said hello. When spring turned to summer, Samoset drifted back north toward his own country along the Maine coast. The colonists sent him off with parting gifts and a promise of future trade, and he went home. Then Samoset largely vanishes from the European written record, though not completely. He turns up in colonial documents over the following decades, mostly in connection with the early English settlement at Pemaquid. There he reappeared as a Sagamore involved in trade and negotiation for his people. You can read between the lines and see a man being steadily squeezed by the slow pressure of more settlers, more trading posts, and more competition for the coast he came from. A deed dated to 1625 Long described as one of the earliest recorded land conveyances between an indigenous leader and English colonists in New England, bears his mark. However, more recent scholars have raised serious doubts about whether the document is authentic or a much later forgery. He's named again on a 1653 deed, and after that the trail goes cold, and he's thought to have passed away around that time, somewhere along his home coast. That said, there's no marked grave, no monument, and no firm date when Samoset passed. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy just jumping in to remind you to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the membership to take your support for my channel to the next level. According to legend, in the autumn of 1929, a laborer digging near the ruins of an old castle in Saga Prefecture, Japan, unearthed a mound of cat bones. They were piled together in a way that suggested something deliberate, something ritualistic, but local historians weren't the least bit surprised. For centuries, the people of that region had whispered about what happened inside those castle walls. It was a story involving a slain woman, a shape-shifting demon, and a prince who slowly wasted away, while something wearing his lover's face drank his life force night after night. It's called The Legend of the Vampire Cat of Nabeshima, and it remains one of the most chilling stories in all of Japanese history. The Nabeshima clan ruled Hizen province on the island of Kyushu from the late 16th century onward. They rose to power through a mixture of political cunning and outright ruthlessness. Most infamously, they had betrayed the Ryuzoji clan, their former liege lord, whose territory the Nabeshima effectively absorbed. It was the kind of power grab that left deep scars on the regional psyche, and due to this act, their reputation was terrible. Many of the supernatural tales associated with the Nabeshima family carried an unmistakable undertone of divine karmic punishment. The spirits of the betrayed, so the stories went, wouldn't rest easily. The Nabeshima lords governed from Saga Castle, and while they maintained stability for generations, their rule was haunted by that memory of how they'd come to power. Ghost stories and vengeful spirit tales attached themselves to the family like barnacles to the hull of a ship. The vampire cat legend is the most famous of these, and it first gained widespread attention through a 19th century literary collection. This was a compilation of strange and supernatural tales from the saga domain, presented as a true secret history rather than fiction. The story begins with Prince Nabeshima Mitsushiga, though historical versions sometimes shift the identity of the prince involved. He was deeply in love with a woman named O Toyo, a concubine of extraordinary beauty, grace, and intelligence. She was, by all accounts given in the tale, the light of the prince's life, his closest companion, and the person who brought him the most joy. Their relationship was the envy of the court, and the prince spent many of his private evenings in her company within the inner quarters of the castle. One night, Otoyo retired to her chambers as usual. What she didn't know was that something had quietly followed her. According to the legend, a massive cat, a bakaneko, or supernatural cat spirit, crept into her room while she slept. The creature eliminated Otoyo silently in the dark, buried her body beneath the veranda of the castle, and then assumed her exact physical form down to the smallest detail. From that moment on, the thing that walked through the halls of Saga Castle and spoke with Otoyo's voice, and lay beside the prince at night, was no longer human, but a cat. This is the part of the story that gives it such lasting power, since there's something profoundly unsettling about a creature that wears the skin of someone you love. The prince noticed nothing at first. Otoyo looked the same, sounded the same, behaved the same, but slowly, imperceptibly, things began to change. Night after night, the prince grew weaker. He became pale, listless, unable to concentrate. His advisors, physicians, and attendants were baffled. There was no obvious illness, no wound, no poison. He simply seemed to be fading, as though something was draining the vitality out of him while he slept. And that, according to the legend, was exactly what was happening. The vampire cat, still disguised as Otoyo, was visiting the prince's bedchamber each night and feeding on his life energy. The creature was consuming him slowly while they lay in bed next to each other. The castle's guards were ordered to keep watch over the prince at night, but something deeply strange kept happening. Every single guard who was assigned to the prince's chamber fell into a deep, unnatural sleep as midnight approached. No matter how disciplined, no matter how alert, they'd simply collapse into unconsciousness right when they were needed most. This continued for weeks, and the prince deteriorated further. The court was gripped by panic, and rumors of a supernatural curse began to spread through the castle like wildfire. It's worth pausing here to note that this narrative device, the guards who can't stay awake, appears in folklore traditions across the world. The inability of protectors to remain conscious in the presence of evil is a deeply archetypal idea, one that speaks to the helplessness people feel when confronting forces they don't understand. Enter Ito Soda, a young soldier of the lower ranks. In some versions, he's a foot soldier, in others, a retainer of modest standing. What matters is that he wasn't a man of great importance. He was simply someone who refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. Ito Soda volunteered to stand guard over the prince, and he came prepared. Knowing that every previous guard had succumbed to sleep, he devised a method to keep himself awake through the night. He placed the blade of his short sword, his wakizashi, pointing into his own thigh, and every time drowsiness crept over him, the pain from the wound jolted him back to full alertness. Soda's willingness to wound himself in order to protect his lord speaks to the samurai ideal of absolute loyalty that was central to the warrior code of feudal Japan. As the night wore on, Ito Soda remained awake. And because he remained awake, he saw what no other guard had been able to see. The false Otoyo entered the prince's chamber and approached the sleeping lord. But when the creature sensed that someone in the room was still conscious, still watching, it hesitated. It couldn't perform its nightly ritual with a witness present. The thing retreated, and for the first time in weeks, the prince slept peacefully through the night. His condition began to improve almost immediately, but due to the low rank of the person who had seen it, the prince's higher retainers were reluctant to accept his claim. Soda's vigil had broken the creature's hold, but it hadn't destroyed it. The false Otoyo continued to exist within the castle, and while the prince's health was recovering, the threat remained. Eventually, Soda was able to report what he'd witnessed directly to the prince's senior advisors, and a plan was devised. They would confront the creature directly. When Soda and a group of armed retainers moved to apprehend the false Otoyo, the creature realized it had been discovered. It dropped its human disguise and revealed its true form, a monstrous cat of enormous size, with blazing eyes and supernatural speed. The beast escaped from the castle grounds and fled into the mountains surrounding Saga. A massive hunting party was organized, and the Nabashima warriors pursued the creature through the dense, mist-covered forests and steep terrain of Heisen province. After a prolonged, exhausting, and dangerous chase through rough terrain, they finally cornered the vampire cat and cut it down. The prince recovered fully, and Soda was rewarded for his bravery and loyalty. The real Otoyo's remains were discovered beneath the veranda, confirming everything the legend had claimed. In the end, the legend of the vampire cat of Nabashima sits in that uneasy space between folklore and history where certainty becomes impossible. The narrative contains unmistakably supernatural elements: a shape shifting demon, guards falling into enchanted sleep, and a creature feeding on a prince's life force. These are all motifs that appear repeatedly in ghost traditions around the world. At the same time, the story is anchored to real people and places, particularly the powerful Nabeshima clan, who ruled Saga for centuries during the era of the Tokugawa shogunate. That mixture is precisely what makes the story so difficult to dismiss entirely. Legends often grow around genuine incidents, transforming ordinary tragedies into supernatural dramas over generations. A sudden illness of a lord, the unexplained death of a court attendant, or political intrigue within Saga Castle could easily have sparked rumors. Once those rumors entered oral storytelling, the details would naturally evolve, eventually merging with the well-known folklore of the Bakaneko yokai demon cat. Each retelling would have layered new embellishments onto the core narrative until the boundary between fact and fiction became impossible to trace. So while the vampire cat itself almost certainly never stalked Saga Castle, the legend may still preserve a faint echo of something real.